The whole world knows that Bette Davis and Joan Crawford hated each other, but few know that the fire started with one man, Franchot Tone. In 1935, Joan Crawford stole Bette Davis's lover, not out of love, but simply to prove that beauty always triumphs over talent. That stolen marriage ignited a brutal war that lasted 40 years. And Hollywood, instead of intervening, turned the pain and jealousy of the two women into billion-dollar entertainment, draining them to their last breath. In the Golden Age, the studio system was a feudal state. There were 5 major families: MGM, Warner Brothers, Paramount, 20th Century Fox, and RKO. And they owned everything. They owned the cameras, the theaters, the distribution networks, and most importantly, they owned the people. They were natural enemies because they represented each other's deepest insecurities. Bette Davis was a serious actress from New England. She valued talent above all else. But Hollywood demanded beauty, and Bette was told she was ugly. She had pop eyes and no sex appeal. She survived by being aggressive and abrasive. She armed herself with intellect to hide her insecurity about her looks. Joan Crawford was the opposite. She rose from poverty and abuse. She scrubbed floors to survive. She viewed Hollywood as her salvation. She invented Joan Crawford, changing her name, her face, and her voice to hide her low-class origins. She was terrified of being exposed as a fraud. Bette looked at Joan and saw a mannequin without talent. Joan looked at Bette and saw an arrogance that threatened her position. In 1935, the professional rivalry became personal. The catalyst was Franchot Tone, a sophisticated actor from a wealthy family. Bette Davis fell in love with him. For the first time, a man treated her as an intellectual equal, not a product. She felt seen. But Joan Crawford wanted him too. For Joan, marrying a man of Tone's class was the ultimate validation. It would erase her past. While Bette was filming, Joan invited Tone to her mansion. She overwhelmed him with luxury and attention. Joan won. They married. Bette Davis was devastated. She did not just lose a man. She lost to the one weapon she did not possess: weaponized femininity. This was the point of no return. This dynamic set the template for the psychological torture chamber they would inhabit for the rest of their lives. They were locked in a game of the grass is always greener. Bette looked at Joan and saw a woman who had love, sex, and adoration. Joan looked at Bette and saw a woman who had respect, critical acclaim, and the serious awards. Neither could enjoy what they had because they were too busy coveting what the other possessed. And what of the prize itself? What of Franchot Tone? This is where the tragedy curdles into farce. The marriage that Joan fought so hard to win, the marriage that broke Bette's heart, began to disintegrate almost immediately. The reality of living with Joan Crawford was very different from the fantasy of dating her. Joan was a perfectionist of pathological proportions. She covered her furniture in plastic. She demanded absolute cleanliness. She was fiercely jealous of Franchot's career, which began to stall as hers continued to soar. Franchot, the great intellectual, found himself reduced to a consort. He began to drink heavily. The gentleman from New York had a mean streak when the whiskey hit him. The domestic fights at the Crawford Tone mansion became the stuff of legend. There were rumors of shouting matches that spilled onto the lawn, of broken vases, of physical altercations. Bette Davis watched this from afar, and one might think she would feel a sense of schadenfreude, a grim satisfaction that the thief was suffering. But Bette loved Franchot. Seeing him destroyed by Joan, as she perceived it, didn't make her feel better. It made her hate Joan more. She didn't just see Joan as a rival anymore. She saw her as a black widow. She believed Joan chewed men up and spit them out. She creates nothing, Bette would later say in private circles. She only consumes. By the late 1930s, the battle lines were calcified. They were no longer just actresses competing for roles. They were ideologies at war. Bette represented the real: pain, grit, unhappy endings, difficult women, art. Joan represented the ideal: beauty, aspiration, happy endings, perfect wives, commerce. The studio system, sensing the heat radiating from this conflict, began to fan the flames. They realized that this personal animosity could be monetized. They started looking for ways to pit them against each other professionally, to overlay the personal narrative onto the screen. Scripts were developed with one of them in mind, then sent to the other just to stir the pot. The feud became a marketing strategy, but the most insidious damage was internal. The loss of Franchot Tone confirmed to Bette Davis that she had to kill the soft part of herself. The woman who wanted love was a liability. That woman got hurt. That woman got humiliated. So Bette Davis, the entity, took over completely. She became harder, sharper, more demanding. She channeled all her libido, all her frustration, all her longing into her work. She entered her golden period at Warner Brothers immediately after this heartbreak. Jezebel, Dark Victory, The Letter, The Little Foxes. Look at those performances closely. They are masterpieces of repressed rage. They are portraits of women who want things they cannot have, women who are punished for their desires, women who are smarter than everyone else in the room, but are trapped by social convention. Bette was playing out her autobiography in reel after reel. She was screaming at the world, and the world gave her Oscars for it. Meanwhile, Joan was trapped in her own hell. She had the man, but she couldn't keep him. She had the stardom, but the critics mocked her. She was terrified that Bette was right, that she was just a clothes horse. So she worked harder. She scrubbed the floors harder. She smiled wider. She adopted children to fill the void that the crumbling marriage created. She became Mommy Dearest, not because she was a monster born, but because she was a woman trying to control a chaotic world with a wire hanger and a bottle of vodka. The marriage of Joan Crawford and Franchot Tone ended in 1939. 4 years. That was the lifespan of the victory. Franchot walked away a broken, alcoholic man. Joan walked away with another failed marriage to add to her resume. Bette walked away with a scar that would never fade. If they had been ordinary women, they might have moved on. They might have met for coffee 10 years later and laughed about the man who came between them. But they were not ordinary women, and Hollywood is not a place that allows for healing. Hollywood picks at scabs. As the 1930s bled into the 1940s, the dynamic shifted again. The war, the real war, World War II, changed the world, and it changed what audiences wanted. They didn't want the high-gloss glamour of MGM as much anymore. They wanted grit. They wanted reality. The pendulum was swinging toward Bette Davis. She was the queen of the lot. She was the highest-paid woman in the country. She was unstoppable. And Joan Crawford, she was starting to slip. MGM, the studio that made her, was beginning to look at her and see lines around her eyes. They saw a relic of the jazz age. They saw a commodity with diminishing returns. Bette watched Joan's decline with a wary eye. She was winning. Finally, definitively, the tortoise was beating the hare. The actress was outlasting the star. But Bette should have known better. She should have remembered that Joan Crawford was made of steel. You can bend steel, you can heat it, you can beat it with a hammer, but it is very, very hard to break. Joan was about to pull off the greatest second act in Hollywood history, and she was going to do it by invading Bette Davis's own home. The war was moving from the bedroom to the boardroom, and the weapons were about to change from love letters to box office receipts. The next phase of destruction was fueled by the machinery of the gossip press, the chorus of harpies who stood on the sidelines cheering for blood. Hedda and Luella were sharpening their pencils. The private tragedy of 1935 was about to become the public sport of the 1940s. The silence of heartbreak was replaced by the cacophony of the tabloids. And the first casualty of this new front would be the truth. The feud was no longer just a feeling. It was now a product, and business was good. By the turn of the decade, the battlefield shifted from the bedroom to the boardroom. The Cold War of the 1930s was over. The invasion was about to begin. The catalyst was the box office poison list of 1938. This wasn't just a critique. It was a moment of reckoning that shattered the illusion of invincibility for the goddesses of the Golden Age. The Independent Theater Owners of America, a group of exhibitors tired of paying exorbitant rental fees for films that didn't sell tickets, took out a full-page advertisement in the trade papers that acted as a death warrant for some of the biggest names in the business. On that list, branded as financial liabilities, were Greta Garbo, Marlene Dietrich, Katharine Hepburn, and, most devastatingly, Joan Crawford. For Joan, whose entire identity was constructed on the foundation of being the public's beloved darling. This was not just a business setback. It was an existential rejection, a sign that the love affair between her and the audience was ending in a messy, public divorce. The fallout from this label was swift and brutal, dismantling the protective cocoon that Louis B. Mayer had built around Joan at MGM for nearly 2 decades. The Tiffany Studio, known for its "more stars than there are in heaven" motto, began to look at Joan Crawford not as their crown jewel, but as a depreciating asset, a relic of the Jazz Age flapper era that had no place in the gritty, war-torn reality of the 1940s. The humiliation culminated in a meeting that has become Hollywood folklore, where Mayer, the paternalistic tyrant who had once wept at Joan's weddings, effectively showed her the door, buying out the remainder of her contract for $100,000. Joan Crawford left MGM, the only home she had ever known, the place where Lucille LeSueur was murdered to give birth to the movie star, with her head held high but her career in tatters. She was approaching 40, a terrifying age in an industry that treated women like milk, fresh one day, sour the next. Most observers wrote her obituary then and there, expecting her to retire to a life of faded glamour and charity work, but they failed to account for the sheer, terrifying resilience of the woman. Instead of retreating, Joan Crawford did the unthinkable. She drove her Packard across town to Burbank and signed a contract with Warner Brothers. She didn't just switch employers, she invaded the sovereign territory of her greatest enemy. Bette Davis was sitting in her dressing room, the Queen's chambers of the Warner lot, when the news broke, and one can only imagine the mixture of shock and fury that must have coursed through her veins. Warner Brothers was her kingdom, a gritty, hard-knock studio that she had conquered through lawsuits, suspensions, and sheer force of will. She was the fourth Warner brother, the undisputed ruler of the lot, the woman who brought prestige to a factory known for gangster flicks. And now, Jack Warner, in a move of sadistic genius, had brought the MGM mannequin, the woman Bette despised as the epitome of artifice, right into her living room. It was a calculated psychological strike. Warner was effectively telling Bette that she was replaceable, that he had a spare tire ready in the garage, should Bette decide to be difficult again. The physical proximity of the two women on the Warner lot created an atmosphere of unbearable tension. A Cold War fought in the commissary and the makeup trailers. Bette, ever the territorial alpha, made her feelings known with her characteristic acerbic wit, famously quipping to a reporter, "We don't need two bitches on this lot." She held court at her lunch table surrounded by intellectuals and crew members, laughing raucously, while Joan, the interloper, ate in solitary confinement in her dressing room, knitting and plotting, studying the terrain of the enemy camp with the patience of a sniper. For 2 years, Joan Crawford did something that baffled the industry. She did nothing. She rejected script after script, enduring the mockery of the press and the silent gloating of Bette Davis, who was churning out hit after hit like The Little Foxes and now Voyager. Bette was in her imperial phase, the highest paid woman in America, confident that she had finally won the long game, that Joan was merely a ghost haunting the hallways of Burbank. But Joan was waiting for a specific kind of weapon. She realized that she could not outact Bette Davis in the realm of histrionics. She had to reinvent herself. She needed a role that would strip away the Adrian gowns and the false eyelashes, a role that would allow her to channel the desperation and terror of her current reality. That weapon arrived in the form of a James M. Cain novel titled Mildred Pierce. It was a hard-boiled, noir-drenched story about a long-suffering mother who sacrifices her dignity and her soul for a monstrous, ungrateful daughter. A role that required the actress to wear cheap waitress uniforms, to look tired, to be humiliated. It was on paper a Bette Davis role. The mythology of Mildred Pierce is central to the feud because it represents the moment Joan Crawford stole the fire from the gods. The producers wanted Bette for the role. It was tailor-made for her brand of suffering and grit, but Bette turned it down. Whether she didn't get the character or whether she simply couldn't lower herself to play the mother of a teenager remains a subject of debate, but her rejection opened the door just a crack. Joan Crawford kicked it down. She did something no star of her magnitude had ever done. She agreed to a screen test. She humbled herself before the camera, wearing a simple cotton dress, letting the harsh Warner lighting expose the lines on her face, proving to the skeptical director, Michael Curtis, who had famously called her a has-been with shoulder pads, that she was willing to destroy her own glamour to get the part. She channeled every ounce of her frustration, her fear of poverty, and her hatred of Bette's dominance into that test. She got the part. And when Mildred Pierce was released in 1945, it wasn't just a hit, it was a revelation. Joan Crawford gave a performance of such restrained, heartbreaking power that she didn't just resurrect her career, she reinvented the entire archetype of the suffering noir heroine. The climax of this invasion occurred on the night of the Academy Awards in 1946, a night that Bette Davis would never forget, for it was the night Joan Crawford perfected the art of weaponized victimhood. Terrified of losing the Best Actress Oscar and unable to bear the thought of sitting in the audience as a washed-up star while someone else took the prize, Joan claimed she was deathly ill with the flu. She stayed home in her Brentwood mansion, purportedly on her deathbed, but this was no ordinary sick day. Joan had transformed her bedroom into a stage set. She had her hair and makeup team prepping her. She had the best photographers in Hollywood waiting in the living room. She had the radio tuned to the broadcast. When her name was announced as the winner, completing the greatest comeback in Hollywood history, the sick Joan Crawford miraculously sat up, her face perfectly powdered, her negligee pristine, clutching the Oscar statuette in a tableau of triumphant vulnerability. The photos of her bedside victory splashed across every front page in America the next morning, pushing the actual ceremony and the other winners into the footnotes. For Bette Davis, this was a devastating psychological blow. Joan hadn't just won an Oscar, she had won Bette's Oscar. She had won it at Bette's studio, with Bette's crew, in a role Bette had rejected. She had proven that she could beat Bette at her own game, on her own turf. The movie star had become an actress, and she had done it with a flair for publicity that Bette, with all her puritanical disdain for stunts, could never replicate. The balance of power had shifted tectonically. For the next few years they were equals on the Warner lot, a situation that made the air thick with toxicity. They were two lionesses circling the same shrinking carcass of the studio system, jostling for the best scripts, the best directors, the best lighting cameramen. The Feud industrial complex was now operating at full capacity, fueled by the twin engines of Hedda Hopper and Louella Parsons, the gossip columnists who acted as the war profiteers of this conflict. It is impossible to overstate the role of Hopper and Parsons in sustaining the hatred between Davis and Crawford. These women were the gatekeepers of Hollywood morality, wielding the power to destroy a career with a single blind item. They realized early on that the Davis versus Crawford narrative was a gold mine, a soap opera that generated endless copy. They functioned as double agents, carrying messages between the two camps like poison-tipped arrows. Louella would lunch with Joan, who would play the role of the misunderstood martyr to perfection. "I admire Bette so much," Joan would whisper, eyes welling with crocodile tears. "I just don't understand why she hates me. I've tried so hard to be her friend, but she just freezes me out." Louella would print this verbatim. Joan Crawford extends olive branch. Davis rebuffs her with icy silence. Then Hedda would call Bette, knowing exactly which buttons to push. "Did you see what Joan said?" she would goad. And Bette, incapable of filtering her rage or playing the victim, would snap back with a quote that could peel paint. "The woman is a fraud. She cries tears of vinegar. She's about as sensitive as a cash register." Hedda would gleefully print, "Davis slams Crawford. She's a cash register." The public chose sides in this fabricated war, projecting their own anxieties about class and femininity onto the two stars. You were either a Davis person, intellectual, serious, rough around the edges, or a Crawford person, glamorous, aspirational, polished. But as the 1940s bled into the 1950s, the ground beneath their feet began to crumble. The studio system, the feudal state that had owned them, protected them, and pitted them against each other, collapsed. The Supreme Court broke the studio's monopoly on theaters. The stable of stars was disbanded. Television arrived like a meteor to render the cinema dinosaur extinct. Suddenly, Bette Davis and Joan Crawford were freelancers. They were women in their mid-40s in an industry that had begun to obsess over the youth and sexuality of Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor. The 1950s became a decade of slow, agonizing humiliation for both of them, a shared descent into irrelevance that should have united them but instead drove them further into their respective fortresses of bitterness. Bette had one last blaze of defiant glory with All About Eve in 1950. It is a supreme irony that the greatest film ever made about an aging actress being replaced by a younger, ruthless fan was played by Bette Davis, the woman who was living that nightmare in real time. Her performance as Margot Channing was not just acting, it was an exorcism. When she delivered the line, "Fasten your seatbelts, it's going to be a bumpy night," she was speaking for an entire generation of women who were being discarded by the culture. But the tragedy of All About Eve was that it was a eulogy, not a rebirth. After the applause died down, the roles dried up. Bette found herself playing aging spinsters, historical curiosities, caricatures of her former self. She left Warner Brothers, drifting from project to project, her personal life in shambles, her fourth marriage collapsing, her relationship with her daughter becoming increasingly fraught. She was a genius without a medium, a queen without a country, Joan fared even worse. Desperate to cling to her status, she married Alfred Steele, the CEO of Pepsi-Cola, in 1955. She tried to pivot from movie star to corporate wife, traveling the world to open bottling plants, forcing Pepsi onto every film set she worked on, wearing diamonds and furs to board meetings. It was a frantic attempt to remain adjacent to power, to find a new hierarchy where she could be queen. But the acting roles she got were embarrassing. Films like Torch Song and Female on the Beach were campy parodies of her former glories, featuring her as tough, shoulder-padded broads who slapped men and suffered in Technicolor. The Joan Crawford type had become a cartoon, a drag performance of itself. By 1959, when Alfred Steele died, leaving her with massive debts and a hostile board of directors who wanted her gone, Joan was staring into the abyss. By the dawn of 1960, both women were pariahs. Jack Warner, the man who had made millions off their backs, now dismissed them with a cruel wave of his cigar, washed up old broads, box office poison. The phone stopped ringing. The scripts stopped coming. They were isolated in their mansions, Joan in her spotless plastic-covered New York apartment, drinking 100 proof vodka to numb the silence. Bette in her Los Angeles home, staring at her 2 Oscars and wondering where the art had gone. They were 2 generals without armies. The war apparently over because the world had simply stopped watching. But desperation is a powerful binding agent, far stronger than friendship. As they looked into the void of obscurity, the one thing they both feared more than death, they realized a terrifying truth. There was only one person left on earth who truly understood the magnitude of their loss. There was only one person who had the same scars, the same history, the same ferocious will to survive. The enemy was the only ally left. And when a gothic horror novel called Whatever Happened to Baby Jane landed on their desks, a grotesque story about 2 aging sisters bound by hatred and mutual dependence, they didn't see an insult. They saw a life raft. They saw a weapon. And for the first time in 25 years, they reached for it together. The year 1962 began with the suffocating silence of a phone that refused to ring. These were not merely unemployed actresses. They were the fallen monuments of a civilization that had been paved over. Hollywood had moved on to the sexual revolution, to the French New Wave, to a kind of cool, detached realism that made the grand operatic emotions of the 1930s and 40s look like ancient history. Bette Davis was performing on Broadway in The Night of the Iguana, playing a secondary role to a much younger actress, her name no longer the only one on the marquee. Joan Crawford was living in a mausoleum of her own making, a widow serving on the board of Pepsi-Cola, forcing a smile while businessmen half her age tried to push her out. They were dinosaurs watching the meteors streak across the sky, and they were starving. It was this starvation that forced them into the unlikeliest alliance in the history of entertainment, a pact signed not in blood, but in pure, unadulterated desperation. The genesis of the film was itself an act of submission. It was Joan who approached Bette. The story goes that Joan found the novel, a dark, twisted Gothic thriller by Henry Farrell, about 2 aging sisters. One, a demented former child star, the other a crippled former screen queen, living in a decaying Hollywood mansion. Joan saw the potential immediately. It was a horror movie, yes, but it was also a meta-commentary on their own lives. It was a story about being forgotten, about the rot of nostalgia, about the terror of losing one's beauty. Joan sent the book to director Robert Aldrich, a man known for his toughness and his ability to handle difficult personalities. And then she did the unthinkable. She went to see Bette Davis. She went backstage at the Royal Theater in New York, walked into the dressing room of the woman she had spent 30 years hating, and made a business proposal. "I have the book," Joan reportedly said. and I have the director, but it won't work without you." It was a moment of profound humility, a recognition that they were two halves of the same broken coin. Bette read the book and agreed, but not before delivering a line that set the tone for the entire production. She looked at Aldrich and asked, "I'll do it. But you have to tell me one thing. Is she playing the cripple or am I?" When Aldrich confirmed that Bette would play the psychotic baby Jane and Joan would play the victim Blanche, Bette smiled. She knew that in the new Hollywood the monster was the better role. Getting the film made was a war in itself. The studio heads viewed the project with open disgust. When Aldrich pitched it to Jack Warner, the man who had built his empire on Bette's back and profited from Joan's comeback, Warner looked at him with disdain and famously said, "I wouldn't give a nickel for those two old broads." It was a brutal assessment of their market value. Warner eventually agreed to distribute the film, but only on a shoestring budget, forcing both actresses to take massive pay cuts in exchange for a percentage of the profits. They were gambling their own livelihoods on the hope that the public still cared enough to watch them suffer. The production was slated for a tight, high-pressure shoot on a small sound stage. The atmosphere was claustrophobic from day one. This was not the MGM glamour of the 30s. This was guerrilla filmmaking. The dressing rooms were small, the air conditioning was practically non-existent, and in this pressure cooker Robert Aldrich placed two volatile chemicals and waited for the reaction. The first battleground was the visual transformation. Bette Davis understood instinctively that Baby Jane was not a vanity project. It was a horror film. She embraced the grotesquerie of the character with a ferocity that terrified even the makeup artists. She refused to look like a faded star. She wanted to look like a rotting corpse. Bette designed her own look for Baby Jane Hudson, the caked-on dead white foundation that cracked when she moved, the black coal eyeliner rimming her eyes like a raccoon, the heart-shaped lipstick drawn over her natural lip line, and the pièce de résistance, a peroxide blonde, ringleted wig that looked like it had been stolen from a dead doll. When she stepped out of makeup for the first time, she looked like a nightmare. She famously told the makeup artist, "I want to look like Mary Pickford's grandmother." Bette was willing to destroy her face to build the character. Joan Crawford, on the other hand, was incapable of such abandon. Even playing a woman who had been confined to a wheelchair for 20 years, Joan insisted on looking glamorous. She fought to wear flattering makeup, to have her hair perfectly coiffed, to wear manicured nails. Bette watched this vanity with contempt. To her, it was proof that Joan was still just a star, worried about her camera angles, while Bette was an actor, worried about the truth. This fundamental difference in their approach to the craft became a source of daily friction. Bette would stomp around the set in ugly orthopedic shoes, inhabiting the madness of Jane, while Joan would sit in her wheelchair, checking her reflection, terrified of looking old. The psychological warfare on the set of Baby Jane has become the stuff of legend, a mix of petty grievances and genuine cruelty that Robert Aldrich, like a ringmaster in a Roman Colosseum, did little to stop. He knew the tension fed the film. He knew that the hatred in Bette's eyes when she looked at Joan needed to be real. The most famous anecdote concerns the Battle of the Sodas. Joan Crawford, as a board member of Pepsi-Cola, took her corporate responsibilities very seriously. She had a Pepsi cooler installed in her dressing room and insisted that Pepsi products be visible on set. Bette, knowing exactly how to get under Joan's skin, had a Coca-Cola machine installed right next to Joan's door. It was a juvenile gesture, yes, but in the high-stakes environment of the shoot, it was a declaration of war. It was Bette saying, "I do not respect your authority. I do not respect your corporate title. You are a joke to me." Every time Joan walked past that Coke machine, it was a reminder of Bette's mockery. But the conflict soon escalated from passive-aggressive branding wars to actual physical violence. The script of Baby Jane required the two women to torment each other physically, and the line between acting and reality blurred until it vanished completely. There is a scene where Jane beats Blanche, kicking her while she lies on the floor. Bette Davis was wearing heavy, clunky shoes. Robert Aldrich, worried about safety, suggested they use a dummy for the close-ups. Bette refused. She insisted on realism. Joan, terrified but unwilling to back down and look weak, agreed to do the scene. According to witnesses, on one of the takes, Bette missed her mark. She swung her foot and connected solidly with Joan's head. Joan screamed, a scream that many on set believed was not acting. Filming stopped. Joan had to be helped to her dressing room, sobbing from pain and shock. Bette simply lit a cigarette and sat down, reportedly saying, "She's milking it." Did Bette Davis intentionally kick Joan Crawford in the head? We will never know for sure. Bette always claimed it was an accident, but given the 30 years of resentment boiling in her blood, it is not hard to imagine that for a split second, her foot was guided not by choreography, but by rage. Joan Crawford was not a woman to take a hit without returning fire. Her revenge was cold, calculated, and physically devastating in its own right. There was a scene later in the film where Jane has to drag Blanche's limp body out of her bed and across the room. Joan knew that Bette suffered from chronic, debilitating back pain. It was Bette's weak spot. Before the scene was shot, Joan went into her dressing room and began to prepare. She put on a heavy lead belt, the kind used by divers or camera operators, to steady equipment. She reportedly filled her pockets with rocks or heavy weights, hiding them under her dressing gown. When the cameras rolled, Joan made her body dead weight in the most literal sense. Bette grabbed her, expecting to drag a woman who weighed perhaps 110 pounds. Instead, she was trying to move an anchor. Bette strained, her face turning red, the veins in her neck popping, her back screaming in agony. Aldrich loved the shot. The exertion looked so real because it was real. He yelled, "Cut!" and Bette collapsed, gasping for breath, clutching her back. Joan, the story goes, simply stood up, dusted off her hands, and walked away with a serene smile, perhaps the only time she ever broke character to enjoy a moment of pure, unadulterated vengeance. Bette was in pain for days afterwards, but she couldn't complain without admitting that Joan had outsmarted her. Despite the violence, or perhaps because of it, the work they were doing was extraordinary. The rushes showed a chemistry that was radioactive. Bette Davis was giving a performance that was manic, terrifying, and deeply pathetic. A gargoyle with the soul of a lost child. Joan Crawford was giving a performance of surprising restraint, her terror palpable, her eyes wide with the genuine fear of a woman who knows she is trapped in a cage with a predator. They were channeling every disappointment, every heartbreak, every ounce of bitterness from their 40 years in the business into these two characters. They were playing out the end of the studio system in real time. The baby Jane they were mourning wasn't just a character. It was their own youth. It was the industry that had loved them and left them. When the film wrapped, there was no wrap party, no tearful goodbyes. They retreated to their separate corners, exhausted and wary. Jack Warner, watching the final cut, realized he had made a mistake. The film wasn't just a horror movie, it was a phenomenon. When Whatever Happened to Baby Jane was released in October 1962, it exploded. The public lined up around the block. It became a massive box office hit, revitalizing the finances of both women. They were suddenly back on the covers of magazines. They were bankable again. For a brief shining moment, it seemed like the gamble had paid off. They had proven the system wrong. They had proven that two old broads could still open a movie, but success, rather than healing the rift, only deepened it. The press tour was a disaster of forced smiles and veiled insults. The narrative of the feud became the primary marketing tool for the film. They were expected to hate each other. It was good for business. And as the Academy Awards season approached, the truce that had held the production together began to disintegrate completely. Bette Davis began to receive the lion's share of the critical acclaim. Reviewers hailed her performance as a masterpiece of the macabre, a brave and fearless transformation. Joan Crawford was praised, yes, but often with the backhanded compliment that she was good at looking scared. The old dynamic was reasserting itself. Bette was the artist, Joan was the star. Bette was already talking about her third Oscar. Joan was being pushed back into the shadows. And Joan Crawford, sitting in her apartment, listening to the praise being heaped on Bette, felt a familiar coldness settling in her chest. She had endured the insults. She had endured the physical pain. She had humiliated herself to get this movie made. And now, Bette was going to take all the glory? No, Joan Crawford had not survived poverty, abuse, and the brutality of MGM to be a stepping stone for Bette Davis's coronation. If she couldn't win the game, she would flip the board over. She began to make phone calls. She began to plot. The set of Baby Jane had been a battlefield, but the 1963 Oscars would be the site of an assassination. The abyss they had stared into during filming was nothing compared to the darkness that was about to unfold on the stage of the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium. The filming had been a brutal trench war, but the awards season became a tactical nuclear exchange. The ceasefire crumbled the moment the Academy Award nominations were announced. The industry officially chose a side. The critics had anointed Bette as the genius of the piece, while Joan was dismissed as merely effective. When the list of nominees for Best Actress was read, the worst-case scenario for Joan Crawford became reality. Bette Davis was nominated. It was her 10th nomination, a historic milestone that cemented her status as the First Lady of the American screen. Joan Crawford was not. The snub was absolute. It was a public declaration by the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences that in the duet of Baby Jane, only one woman was singing. For Joan, this was not merely a disappointment, it was a soul-crushing humiliation. It confirmed her deepest, most terrifying insecurity, that despite all the hard work, despite the suffering, despite the decades of stardom, she was still just a movie star, while Bette was the artist. The industry was willing to exploit Joan's image to sell the movie, but they were only willing to honor Bette's talent. Most people, faced with this kind of humiliation, would have retreated. They would have issued a gracious statement, attended the ceremony with a frozen smile, and gone home to cry in private. But Joan Crawford was not most people. She was a woman who had clawed her way out of poverty by refusing to accept the word no. If the Academy wouldn't give her a seat at the table, she would burn the table down. The plan she hatched in the weeks leading up to the ceremony is perhaps the single most Machiavellian maneuver in the history of Hollywood. A plot so spiteful, so elaborate, and so brilliant that it deserves to be studied by military strategists. Joan realized that if she couldn't win the Oscar, the next best thing, the only thing that would soothe her wounded ego was to ensure that Bette didn't win it either, or, failing that, to ensure that if Bette lost, Joan would be the one standing in the spotlight to witness the execution. Step 1 of the Crawford revenge protocol was the sabotage campaign. Joan began to work the phones. She used her influence, her charm, and her deep connections within the industry to subtly campaign against Bette. She whispered to columnists that Bette had been difficult on set, that Bette was an egomaniac, that Bette's performance was over the top and unworthy of the golden statue. But Joan knew that whispering wasn't enough. She needed a contingency plan for the ceremony itself. She looked at the list of other nominees in the Best Actress category. Katharine Hepburn for Long Day's Journey into Night, Lee Remick for Days of Wine and Roses, Geraldine Page for Sweet Bird of Youth, and Anne Bancroft for The Miracle Worker. It was a strong field, but Joan noticed a logistical detail that gave her an opening. Several of the nominees were based in New York or performing in plays and would likely not be able to attend the ceremony in Santa Monica. Joan Crawford picked up the phone and called Anne Bancroft in New York. Bancroft was a serious stage actress, a woman of the theater, currently starring in Mother Courage. She was the dark horse of the race. Joan turned on the full force of the MGM charm. She was gracious, she was maternal, she was the grand dame of Hollywood reaching out to a younger peer. "My dear Anne," she reportedly said, "I know you are busy with your play and cannot make it to the awards. It would be a tragedy if you won and weren't represented. It would be my absolute honor as a fellow actress and admirer to accept the award on your behalf if your name is called." Anne Bancroft, likely flattered, and perhaps a bit bewildered by the attention from such a legend, agreed. Why wouldn't she? It was a nice gesture. Joan then made the same call to Geraldine Page. She secured the rights to be the proxy for the opposition. It was a master stroke of psychology. Joan was effectively betting against her own co-star, positioning herself to be the physical embodiment of Bette Davis's defeat. If Anne Bancroft won, the person walking up those stairs to collect the trophy wouldn't be Anne Bancroft. It would be the woman Bette Davis hated most in the world. It was a way for Joan to hijack the victory, to insert herself into a moment that had nothing to do with her. It was identity theft on a grand scale. The night of April 8, 1963 arrived. The atmosphere at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium was electric. Bette Davis arrived believing she was the frontrunner. She wanted this Oscar. She wanted it desperately. It would be her third win, a record that would make her the undisputed queen of history. She felt vindicated by the success of Baby Jane, feeling that she had dragged the industry kicking and screaming into a new era. Bette didn't dress like a movie star that night. She dressed like a serious woman. She wore a simple, elegant dress, her hair done simply. She was there to collect her due. Then Joan Crawford arrived. She wasn't a nominee. She wasn't a presenter, but she swept into the auditorium like she owned the building. She was armored for battle. She wore a silver-sheathed dress encrusted with bugle beads that caught every photon of light in the room. She had diamonds dripping from her ears and neck. Her hair was a helmet of perfection. She had an entourage. She positioned herself backstage in the green room, holding court, flashing that wide, terrifying smile at everyone. She had the proxy papers from Anne Bancroft and Geraldine Page in her purse like a loaded weapon. Bette saw her. She must have felt a chill. The sheer audacity of Joan's presence was a signal that something was wrong. Why was she here? Why was she dressed like the winner? The ceremony dragged on. The tension in the auditorium grew as the final awards approached. Bette Davis sat in her seat, chain-smoking, her leg bouncing nervously. She had prepared a speech. She had visualized the moment. She looked around the room, assessing her competition. Hepburn wasn't there. Remick was. But the buzz was on Bette. The sentimentality was on her side. The comeback narrative was perfect. Finally, the moment arrived. Maximilian Schell, the Best Actor winner from the previous year, walked onto the stage to present the award for Best Actress. He read the nominees. Bette Davis for Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. The applause was thunderous. Bette allowed herself a small, tight smile. Katharine Hepburn, Lee Remick, Geraldine Page, Anne Bancroft. The silence that followed the reading of the names felt like it lasted an hour. Bette leaned forward slightly. She was ready to stand. She was ready to walk up those stairs and look down at the industry that had tried to bury her. Maximilian Schell opened the envelope. He glanced at the card. He leaned into the microphone. The winner is Anne Bancroft for The Miracle Worker. The air went out of the room. It was a shock. A gasp rippled through the audience. Bette Davis froze. For a split second, her face registered a look of pure, unadulterated devastation. The color drained from her cheeks. She had lost. The comeback was incomplete. The history would not be made tonight. And then, before the applause could even fully crest, Bette felt a movement beside her. Or perhaps she just saw the flash of silver in her peripheral vision. Backstage, Joan Crawford didn't hesitate for a microsecond. She didn't look surprised. She looked like a sprinter hearing the starting gun. She famously snubbed Bette. Some accounts say she breezed past her with a cool, "Excuse me." Others say she simply brushed against her in her haste and walked out onto the stage. The applause that was meant for Anne Bancroft washed over Joan Crawford. She stepped into the spotlight, that blinding white light she had chased since she was a girl in Texas, and she smiled. It was a smile of absolute predatory triumph. She took the Oscar from Maximilian Schell. She held it high. She looked out at the audience, and for a few glorious minutes she was the winner. She gave a gracious, elegant speech on Anne Bancroft's behalf, thanking the Academy, thanking the cast, thanking the producers. She played the role of the benevolent proxy perfectly. But everyone in that room and everyone watching at home knew what they were seeing. They were seeing a public execution. Joan Crawford was holding the Oscar that Bette Davis had wanted. She was standing in the spot where Bette Davis should have been. She had stolen the show. She had managed to make Bette's loss about Joan's glamour. It was the ultimate scene-stealing moment. Joan knew that the photo in the papers the next morning wouldn't be of a sad Bette Davis. It would be of a triumphant Joan Crawford holding the gold. Backstage, the scene was even more grotesque. Joan, clutching the Oscar, posed for photographs with the other winners, Gregory Peck, Patty Duke, Ed Begley. She beamed, she laughed. She held court with the press, answering questions about dear Anne and how happy she was to help. Bette Davis was nowhere to be found. She had retreated to the shadows, decimated. She later said that moment was one of the darkest of her life. It wasn't just the loss of the award, it was the sheer malice of the maneuver. It was the realization that Joan hated her enough to orchestrate a complex logistical operation just to twist the knife. The fallout from that night changed the dynamic of their feud forever. Before the 1963 Oscars, it was a rivalry. After the 1963 Oscars, it was a blood feud. There was no going back. The pretense of professional respect was gone. Bette Davis realized that Joan Crawford was not just a competitor. She was a nemesis in the classical Greek sense, a force of nature designed to torment her. But what did this victory actually gain Joan? In the cold light of day, she hadn't won an Oscar. She had just held someone else's. It was a hollow victory, a triumph of optics over substance. It reinforced the very narrative she was trying to escape, that she was all surface, all image, a woman who could wear the dress but couldn't do the work. By stealing the spotlight, she confirmed Bette's diagnosis of her, that she was a star, not an actress. A star needs to be seen. An actress needs to be believed. And yet, in the twisted logic of their relationship, Joan had won the round. She had denied Bette the satisfaction of a clean narrative. She had turned Bette's tragedy into a farce. She had proven that even when she wasn't on the ballot, she could still control the outcome. It was a display of power, pure, and simple. The 1963 Oscars marked the end of the Baby Jane era and the beginning of the final ugly decline. There would be no sequel, at least not one that starred both of them. They would try, of course, because the money was too good to ignore, but the trust was gone. The bridge had been nuked. The ambush at the Oscars had poisoned the well so thoroughly that no amount of money could purify it. Bette Davis went home that night without a trophy, but she went home with a new resolve. She would never ever let Joan Crawford get the better of her again. The next time they met on a soundstage for the ill-fated Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte, Bette would be the one holding the weapon. And this time, she wouldn't miss. After the Oscars, they never reconciled. They spent their final years in low-budget horror movies, becoming caricatures of themselves. Joan Crawford died in 1977. Bette Davis's reaction was cold. My mother told me to only speak good of the dead. Joan Crawford is dead. Good. In the end, the system that pitted them against each other won. Both women died lonely. Both were betrayed posthumously by their own daughters, who wrote tell-all books exposing them as monsters. They sacrificed everything for a legacy that was ultimately dismantled by their own families. It was the final exploitation.